Decolonize Science. For our second session today, we'll be briefly focusing on the decolonization of medicine, which is aimed to spark discussion and debate among students to question how medicine is taught, how the system it functions in works, and ultimately, what change can be brought about to actively decolonize medicine. The decolonization of medicine is something close to my heart, being a first-year medical student, where the lingering colonial presence in our medical curriculum and institutions of higher learning is evident, as is its presence in medicine and health as a whole. Through this discussion, we hope to shed some light on some of these aspects to allow us to question and begin the interrogation of our medical curriculum and medicine in its entirety. It's this questioning and interrogation that is by far one of the most powerful tools we can use to force ourselves to become conscious in every other medical space we enter in order to enact change. We have two incredible speakers here with us today who will be sharing their insights and opinions on this topic. Welcome Shehnaz Munshi and Karsten Noko. We are honored to have you present in this conversation and are looking forward to learning from and engaging with you both.
Hi, everybody. How are you doing? I wonder if you can see and hear me.
Yes, we can see and hear you.
Okay, so thank you so much for this invitation and for making space at Wits University in the Faculty of Health Sciences for such an important discussion and debate. I am delighted that you have arranged this because since my colleague and I had hosted an Africa health convening at the in actually a year ago, at the end of September, the beginning of October 2020, we've sparked a lot of interest in this topic and a lot of invitations to speak in the global north. So we've got invitations from, Harvard and Duke University and in universities in London and in some areas of Europe. But on the continent, there's been 2 invitations, and in South Africa, only 1. So this is the first to actually engage on this topic. And the concern for me is that this is where the conversation needs to be located. And I'm really hoping that this is a collective conversation. And towards the end of the presentation today, we find ourselves all in a position where we're inspired, motivated, and willing to take forward this debate and really elevate it to own it and to kind of do what I'm asking for, which the decolonial imperative and the decolonial feminist imperative is asking for, is to really fight for social justice. So with that, I'm going to present and share my slide. I'd also like to say that I had a wonderful chat with the next speaker, and we recognize that there's a limited time, so we're going to try to manage the discussion in such a way that you are supported to getting some of the theory from me, and we can deep dive into what does this mean, what is the practical elements, and how can you begin to think in your own lives because you have your own experiences, and we can have a discussion and debate either now or at another time. So with no further ado, I'm going to start the slideshow. Can we all see this?
Sorry, Shehnaz. I just wanted to read the bios for both you and Karsten before we start. So if I can just quickly read that.
Sure.
Thanks. Shanaz Munshi is a health policy and systems researcher and activist with a particular interest in feminism, decolonial scholarship, and praxis. She's also an occupational therapist with 10 years of experience serving vulnerable and marginalized communities in South Africa and the UK. Her research policy engagement and activism have focused on strengthening the implementation of a community health worker policy and primary healthcare re-engineering policy in an NHI context. She was also a researcher on a behavior change intervention study called the Sonke Change Trial, which sought to determine the effectiveness of a multi-level gender transformation model in preventing men's use of violence against women and girls, and currently also manages the Sheham Family WITS program on social determinants of health and health inequality at the WITS School of Public Health. She co-designed an initiative aimed at reimagining health systems, drawing on transformative Indigenous and feminist approaches to achieve health equity and social justice. Carsten Noko is a humanitarian aid practitioner from Zimbabwe. He's a lawyer by training and has been working in different conflict-affected areas in Africa and Asia, where he's led the implementation of projects to provide healthcare. His interests lie in humanitarian policy and the provision of assistance in conflict zones. He's passionate about the intersection of law and access to healthcare. Carsten has published on equity in access to healthcare, as well as various other topics that speak to the interrelation between health policy and practice. He's currently studying towards an LLM in human rights law. So now we can start with Shehnaz Munshi and then Carsten Noko. And just a reminder that if you do have questions, kindly send them through the chat box so we can attend to them after this discussion. And I agree with you, Shanaz. I think it's so important that we have these conversations in Africa specifically, as opposed to other places in the world. And I'm also so excited to engage with this topic. And I hope that our listeners and audience also come with questions and spark conversation. And you can start when you're ready.
Thank you so much. Just to let you know that I don't have access to the chat box while the presentation's on. So if there are questions, points of clarification, rather stop me even in the middle of the presentation or type it in the chat box that we can attend it to the end. You can decide. I think the point is that this is a session that is not about me presenting and about you as the audience to really understand. So feel free to engage as we go along. Okay. So in this session, as I said, I will start with taking a step back and like trying to bring context, because this word is a buzzword at the moment. It's being used and utilized by everybody, and it actually can get quite confusing, and it can mean different things for different people. And often those in positions of power take terminology and use it for their own agendas. And this is a concern that we need to pay attention to and ensure that we are clear about what our idea of decoloniality, decolonizing is. And so I'm putting forward an approach drawing from theorists, and I'd like you to go to these theorists and read for yourself. So, it's not going to the next slide. Oh, there we go. So Ramon Grosfugel is our first decolonial scholar I would like to introduce. And he's from Puerto Rico, and he basically made it clear that there is a myth that currently we live in a post-colonial world. But he talks about this myth as a very powerful myth, that the notion of elimination of colonial administrations amounted to the decolonization of the world. He says the heterogeneous and multiple global structures put in place over 450 years ago did not evaporate with the judicial political decolonization of the periphery over the past 50 years. He is basically saying that we continue to live under the same colonial matrix of power. And it may not look the same, but it is entrenched in our systems and structures. So let's first go to what is colonialism. And this is a very complex power structure that has transformed people's way of life. And it's an invention of asymmetrical power relationships between those who are colonized and those who are the colonizers, where those who are colonized are considered citizens and those who are colonized are considered subjects. It's an economic disposition project that considers or is about the transfer of economic resources from those who are indigenous to those who are conquering. And I think we need to keep that in mind, even in the context of medicine and health, and how it was these elements of life are sewed and tied into economics, and it cannot be um, separated. We need to start thinking in systems ways and in very complex ways. Now, if you look at this image, you see these two white men working on an African body, and you kind of like think, oh, they're healers, they're helping, they're good, they're trying to make a difference. But actually, it claims to be a civilizing project, but it hides its sinister motive. We need to be a little bit more critical about how we look at images in our world and in the world of the past. And some of these images reproduce itself, but they look very different. And I'm going to show you one that I'd like you to see. Who's in the foreground, who's in the background, who has voice, who doesn't, who has space, who doesn't, who can do things, who's powerful, who's not. Okay, so here's the next image. So have a look at the student. She actually is not from South Africa. She's from the Rhodes Must Fall movement in the UK. But the image resonates because it is not only in the former colonies, but also in the UK, the colonial master, where people of color are silenced and are looking for new ways of being and doing. So coloniality is that condition. Remember, we spoke about this myth. This myth at the bottom, it says we continue to live under a colonial matrix of power. And some decolonial scholars have given that term a name. So Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni, someone you need to get familiar with, he basically said it's the condition that survives beyond the period of colonization. It's an invisible power structure that sustains colonial relations of exploitation and domination long after colonization. And another decolonial scholar that you may be familiar with, because he's come many times to South Africa, is Nelson Maldonado Torres, who basically says we breathe in coloniality every day. So what is this colonial matrix of power? Basically, they're the organizing principles of the colonial project. They interact and intersect with each other, and they enable coloniality to reproduce itself. In South Africa, as well as in India and in some other parts, racism was a technology used by the colonial master to divide, rule, and conquer. Heteropatriarchy is another organizing principle that's utilized pretty much everywhere in the world, and capitalism. And there are obviously more forms of power, but these are the three most salient and important principles. And I urge you to consider others as well. But they are based on a power asymmetry. You don't have heteropatriarchy is a power asymmetry between the male body and the female body, and all those who are in the binaries, non-binaries. Racism is between the white body and the black body, or the white body and the other, anybody other than white. And capitalism is really around those who have resources and economic power. Okay. And so we need to consider it as a structural determinant of health for those of you who are interested in public health. And these principles, they important for us because they help inform a decolonial approach. So we need to know them. We need to get to understand them. And this is going to help us in our quest going forward. So we need that decolonial lens because we're arguing as decolonial scholars, we're arguing that injustices in the world are rooted in the colonial project. And we need to develop a systemic and structural understanding of how these organizing principles of coloniality are entrenched in health, public health, global health. So it's the same point I made in this previous slide, but I'm emphasizing it here that the goal of the understanding is not about trying to get to a solution or some kind of silver bullet or some sort of answer or solution to what's next. Right now, we first need to begin to sit in the problem, unpack it, see it in us, see it in how it is, how we engage in the world, see it in how we enact care as healthcare practitioners, see how it exists in our universities and in our schools and in our educational systems, and then in our health systems and in other systems like the social system, education system, and get to know it really carefully, and solutions will emerge, the way forward will emerge. So in this way, because we are developing a critical eye, a critical lens, we cannot claim to be biased, a non-biased. We are biased. Okay, we are biased because we are politicizing our research and we are politicizing our health care. We're becoming political agents of decoloniality with an agenda of social justice. So I think this is not really, there's certain questions you need to ask yourself. Okay, so the first one is, how does the past live in my present? So if I'm saying that the injustices are rooted in the colonial project, how can I examine my own life and see where I, as a woman, how have I been disadvantaged? As um, as a healthcare worker, what power do I have? So we need to start examining ourselves, and we need to see, where does coloniality live and how does the past live in my present, including why am I of an Indian heritage living in an African country. The second thing is, we've got to disrupt coloniality. And what does disruption mean for me? Am I prepared to politicize my work? Am I prepared to join the revolution? Am I prepared to distribute my economic, financial, and intellectual power to those who have little, but who are human and deserve the full humanity and respect and care that I do and that those in the North does? Are we critical about the inequalities and inequities that exist? So what I'm asking you to do, is one way forward, is to develop a practice of reflexivity. How you knowingly or unknowingly reproduce powers in your ways of being and doing. How do you become those white men sitting in the front, taking care of people without considering who they are? What is their story? And when you write your doctor's notes or you write your field notes, or how do you frame their lives? How do you create the narrative of their illnesses? Do you understand fully? Can you understand fully the needs and the health of another? So we then go, I'm going to quite quickly go by, I don't know how much time I have left. And I'm hoping that all of you know that decolonization is an actual physical removal of the withdrawal of the colonial rule. Okay. And so we've moved from coloniality now to decoloniality. And this is where we start talking about it being a political, epistemological, and economic liberation project aimed at dislodging coloniality and its manifestations. It's a practice, an ongoing project. It's about ways of being and doing in the world. I am part of the Africa Health Futures Project, and we call it a conscientization project, where we're interested in disruption, delinking, disentangling, liberation, reclaiming, rebuilding, and moving away from a deficit model to kind of a model where we recognize that we sit with power to change our world in the way that makes sense for us. So how does coloniality manifest? And I've mentioned big terms like coloniality, the organizing principles of heteropatriarchy, racism, and capitalism. But they show up in different ways, and I'm going to break it down into coloniality of power, knowledge, and being. And this is an organizing framework developed by Sabelo Ndlovu Kacheni to help us understand some of these manifestations. And these exist as the colonial power is more about technologies of domination, control, and exploitation. The knowledge is around domination over knowledge, the production and legitimization of knowledge, and coloniality of being is around the process of dehumanization. So let's deep dive, okay? And yeah, if I'm going too slow, please do let me know. So coloniality of power is really refers to this asymmetrical power relations. And it is these technologies of domination, control, and exploitation of violence. So if I go a step back and I ask you to look at these pictures, you see some activists that I'm also part of the C19 coalition. I'm part of the People's Health Movement that went outside to the French embassy and basically said to the French embassy, you know, it's your best chance um, to protect people, not farmer greed, regards South Africa. So what this is showing is that as a country in the global south, we are dependent on a country like France in the global north for our healthcare because they holding back pharmaceutical patents, monopolies, and they the C19 coalition went to all the European countries at the end of last year, I think, when vaccines, the discussions were just emerging. So it's not only France that they went to, but none of the embassies actually opened their doors, and none of them accepted the memorandum handed over by the activists. But this is in South Africa, and if you look at how few people are standing outside, it shows you how few people are making these links and how much more resistance we need to actually put to ensure that we hold France and all those um, so it's about the structural processes in the global imperial design that sustain the superiority of the North and maintain the inferiority of the South. When I talk about global imperial design, I literally am talking about the World Health Organization, the IMF, the UN, and all of these bodies that influence all dimensions of social existence. So Ramon Grasfugel, who I introduced at the first slide, he identified 9 forms of domination and exploitation. And you can see here that you can recognize many, religion being one, epistemic, gender, race, language, knowledge, um, epistemic is knowledge, class, sexuality, ethnicity, and political military. So what's an example in the health sector? I'm sure many of you know about women's reproductive health and the need for many women to access abortion services. Now, women need abortion for many reasons. Sometimes it's an unwanted pregnancy. Sometimes it's a teenage pregnancy. Maybe a pregnancy occurred as a result of rape. There are many multiple reasons why maybe a woman is unable to negotiate condom use. There are many multiple reasons why a woman may need an abortion. However, it did not sit well with President George Bush, who believed that it was against his religious values. He decided that any money donated from the US to South Africa would have a gag rule instituted that would mean that no money can go to abortion rights. And then you had, after George Bush, you had President Obama, who value systems were pro-abortion, and he took away the gag rule. Then we had President Trump that put it back. And here you have, in January of this year, President Biden repeals the global gag rule and allows countries to use money for abortion rights. So in this case, the coloniality of power is where the lived realities of women in post-colonial countries are impacted by these powerful global forces, and the US foreign policy influences national policies. US values trump South African values, and certain women are more affected than the others. So those who cannot access abortion services locally and are reliant on aid are impacted. And these are grounded in the constructs of religion in order to assert domination and control. So money is then instrumentalized as power, and you see the system becomes structurally and institutionally violent to women. That's a term that I'd like you to start considering. How are your systems and structures in structurally violent or institutionally violent? Other examples that I need you to understand is, especially as doctors or medical students or healthcare workers or bioethics students, how do you perpetuate power in your clinical hierarchy, in the space for where a person comes to you for care? How do you classify them? And there are many other examples that I'm not going to go through, but you can see them here. The next one is coloniality of knowledge, which refers to the process of domination over knowledge. And it's over the production, the patterns of knowledge. And here is a picture of Ramon Grosfugo, who spoke about in many readings and books and YouTube clips about the destruction of knowledge, which he called epistemicide. And many of us form part of cultures that feel the pain of the destruction of libraries and knowledge systems that could have informed a very different way of living. And knowledge was stolen and claimed as, as certain people's when it wasn't developed by them. So unfortunately, we need to understand that the domination of knowledge allows for some knowledge to become the only legitimate ways of understanding the world. And this is the Western current is the Western system and Westernized knowledge, and the language of instruction is English. And I urge you to read Ramon Grosfugo. So what do we need? So here's another image from the East, similar kind of picture, and a map at the bottom. And what Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni talks about is he says we need a kind of shifting of the agenda and the shifting of the geography and biography of knowledge from those who generate it, so that we see that those who generate knowledge look like us. Okay, so and so he asks the question, who generates knowledge and from where? And many of us look to our schools and our universities for knowledge, but perhaps we need to look at our mothers, our grandmothers, our communities, where there are other kinds of knowledges that exist. We need to start shifting the paradigm of how we create hierarchies of knowledge, and how we strive for reading literature or understanding poetry or understanding knowledge that is from a particular dominant paradigm. And to come back to this issue of the global gag rule, President Trump in his speech, he showed that the global gag rule does not fit with American religious values, and he uses language of moral virtuosity, and it's kind of like this thing of punishment on women who a punishment that they're going to go back to these illegal places to get their abortions, and it's absolute lack of care. So whose ideas count? How is knowledge imposed? What kind of knowledge informs policy processes? And how do management structures, even in our hospitals and clinics, adapt to the values that are instilled by the knowledge that is dominant? And how do you introduce unconscious biases, or even these women, this language of shame and sin and judgment? So here are other ways in which coloniality of knowledge exists. And in our case, many of us in the sciences and the health sciences are more concerned about scientific knowledge, epidemiology versus the social sciences. We're more interested in knowledge that comes out of the Lancet journal as opposed to our mothers and grandmothers and traditional healers. The production of knowledge, the whole system of publications, these privileging certain researchers, these are ways in which power and knowledge live together. The third one is the coloniality of being. This is literally the denial of the humanity of certain people and the process of inferiorization and dehumanization. And you have the othering of the colonized compared to the white subject. And so if you look at these pictures, it's very clear that in the Black Lives Matter protests, they are calling out the coloniality of being. They're calling out by saying, we will no longer be dehumanized. We are not inferior. We matter. Muslims in India face the threat of elimination out of India because of the Hindu extremism, where the caste system becomes a form of coloniality that exists. And we need to be careful because the Indian government sometimes uses the language of decoloniality to promote other forms of domination and control, such as casteism, which is more ancient and even more violent. And then the xenophobic violence that we see in South Africa, which is also a form of dehumanization. Okay, so I think I've got about 2 or 3 more slides. And I'm not going to go through this, but I want you to see that there are forms and ways in which the colonizers use technologies like slavery and genocide to literally dehumanize. And to bring it back to South Africa, we have scholars and thinkers here that have taught us that the most potent weapon in the minds of the oppressed, in the hands of the oppressor, is the minds of the oppressed. What are we going to do about this? And looking back at the abortion issue, looking at this image on the side, you see this white man holding a slide that says abortion hurts women, whereas this woman is saying, my body, it's my choice. Reproductive justice is an important issue. Women's lives and reproductive health should not be controlled by men or by money or by language of shame and guilt. And women need agency to be able to make decisions that serve them. Yeah, so I would like to say thank you, and this is my presentation today.
Thank you so much. It was incredible listening to you and learning from you. And I think it was so powerful for me to hear, like, when you mentioned Steve Biko and how it's our minds that we need to liberate in that sense. And then linking that back to knowledge and how we shouldn't only rely on schools and university for our knowledge, but also looking at our mothers and looking at our grandmothers. In that sense, is just such a liberating feeling to when looking at decolonization. So thank you so much for that. I think we can go on to Carsten, and then remember that you can put up your hand if you have any questions or that kind of thing, because I see that we don't have a chat box.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Amara, and thank you, Shanaz. As I said, it's really interesting to hear from you and to learn from you. And I think you have set a very good sort of introduction to what I hope to be talking about, which is basically, as Amara said in the introduction, so I'm a humanitarian aid practitioner working with a medical organization, and many of these things that Shanaz speaks about, things that we see in practice. And I'm sure many of you also see or you will be seeing when you're working in health facilities, and very often we struggle to be able to to name these things. But so I will try and take you through a couple of questions that I'm trying to answer in my presentation. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. I hope you will forgive me for that. I will try and speak, and hopefully afterwards we can have a discussion. I will apologize in advance as well. I'm not sure how good my internet is. I am in a place where just basic internet connection is a bit of a luxury, so to speak. But please do stop me if you have any questions or if it is not clear, and I can try and go a little bit slower, or try and turn my video off as well if the connection does not work very well. So I will try to look at three basic questions that Amara mentioned in the introduction of the talk. And the three questions that I will be looking at are the following. So the first one is, why should we question how medicine is taught? Why should we question how science is taught? And the next is to try to see how these things that we are faced with on a day-to-day basis in practice, how do we understand them to function, and try to link that with what Shanaz was saying, and try to give examples as well of what I have both seen but also read about, more importantly, during the time that I've been working in other parts of the world. And then lastly, to, of course, answer, at least reflect on the very difficult question of what change can be brought about if we need to decolonize medicine. What is it that we should do? So I will try and go to the first question. Why should we question how medicine is taught? And for me, the answer sounds a bit cliche, but yes, I think for me the point is that knowledge is subjective. I think if we were listening to what Shanaz was saying about production of knowledge, we have the rather very simple case of why should we listen to what a published paper in the Lancet says over what my grandmother says in the village. So we know that knowledge is subjective. The value of knowledge is subjective. We value certain knowledge because of where it comes from, and not just because of its content. We value knowing that if what you learn and what you know is regarded as acceptable, especially in the global north, therefore it has much more value than what is regarded as knowledge in the global south. But also we have to question why medicine is taught the way that it is, because I think we have to question everything. Actually, it's not just medicine that is under the yoke of colonization, and that we need to look at in a decolonization frame. But it is all aspects of law. As you said, I am a law student. I'm a lawyer by training, and for me, even in the legal field, we are having the same discussions about how do you decolonize the law, and how do you decolonize the way that people experience the law. So what we see is that knowledge is imparted to us based on the subjective knowledge of those that are giving us the knowledge. And that, of course, is informed by their own social realities as they teach us. It is not possible for me to share a knowledge that I do not know about. And what I know is determined by my own social realities. So whether depending on where I went to school, or who I've interacted with, or where I've worked, or where I've traveled to, that is what at the end of the day becomes the sum total of the knowledge that I have, and that is what I can share. And so I think if we look at that, we do see that we cannot expect someone to teach us something that they themselves do not know about. So for that reason, we realize that knowledge is subjective. It is not objective at all. We only share that which we know, and therefore it is very important to reflect on who we are as we share knowledge with other people, and what influences that what we know. And then trying to, of course, go a little bit into the other practical examples. I remember in April of 2020, when COVID started to be a thing, there were some doctors in France in a television interview having a discussion about because some drug companies were starting to talk about developing vaccines, and they were saying that vaccines should be trialed on Africans because they do not have access to PPE and masks, which of course for many of us who live in the continent know that this is not true at all. We can talk about the fact that, well, maybe there's not enough PPE or there's not enough masks, but it would be ridiculous for anyone to believe that if you walked into a hospital, that healthcare workers would not know what a mask is or what PPE is. But the point really is that for these French doctors, they have a certain image of Africa, and that knowledge which they are sharing with their citizens is limited to what they know. And when you start to look at it coming from a doctor, of course, you have to start asking, how come this doctor does not know that, we have hospitals where healthcare workers have PPE and they have masks, and I think that's a point to ponder on. Again, using the COVID example, and I will use a lot of the COVID examples because not only is it still a reality, but because it is a pandemic, many people have read or listened to, at least can relate to some of these examples. We had also at the beginning of the pandemic, where people in other parts of the world started to question why Africa was not seeing as many numbers of COVID cases, and there were two things that for me stood out in the tone with which these questions were being asked. So firstly, there is the whole suspicion about the fact that ministries of health in African countries can actually collect reliable data. So always the data is not trustworthy and all of these. So that's the first part, and that has its own issues. But secondly, also what came out was there was starting to be these discussions that, well, maybe Africans actually protected from COVID in one way or the other. Maybe their DNA, maybe because of their race, maybe because of whatever else. Actually, they are different from us. This is why we are suffering from the burden of COVID, and because they are different, therefore they are not affected, which again just goes to show how people, continue to be dehumanized, and you have this brilliant quote from a not so brilliant man many years ago, writing when he went on an expedition to what is present day DRC, in his book called Heart of Darkness, and this was in 1899, so well over 100 years ago. And writing about the people that he was meeting, and I will quote this. He says, "Were the people human? No, they are not inhuman. Well, that's the worst of it. This suspicion of not being inhumane." And I always reflect on this quote and to think again about how, as people, one of the worst things that can happen to anyone really, and to a patient that is under your care, is you suspecting or having to suspect their humanity. Because again, I cannot prove to you that I'm human. If you do suspect that I'm not human, there's nothing that I can do to prove that. So I'll stop there on the first question, and then just quickly, in the interest of time, try to go to the second issue. How does the system actually function? And try to use some of the examples from global health, from both the continent, but also from other parts of the world. Go back to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, 2014, that some of you may know about. And during the Ebola outbreak, unbeknown to many people, but about 250,000 blood samples were collected from patients by laboratories from France, from the United States, from the United Kingdom, with no informed consent from people from which the blood was being drawn from, and this was done for research, for everything from drugs to vaccines. As you know, that Ebola is one of the diseases that the world still suffers from, in terms of everything from diagnostics to treatment to vaccines is still very much in development stage. And of course, I mean, there's an issue of why that is the case, but that is not for today. And interestingly as well, from this research that was being done, some of the researchers also happen to be South African, which I find quite interesting, especially discussing with you guys. The interesting thing is that they refuse until today to share how many samples they hold onto. So after collecting 250,000 blood samples back in 2014, they refuse to tell anyone, so including the patients themselves, including their governments. They refuse to tell them because they cite national security. So they say we cannot tell you how many blood samples we collected from you because of our own national security. And I think one patient that was being interviewed by journalists sort of put it very well when they say that, you know, they are using these blood samples to make research, and they will make billions of dollars, and the medicine will not be for free. So you come to me, you collect a blood sample from me, you go and do research. You don't even tell me what you will do with the blood samples or where you keep it and how many of these samples you have. You refuse to be accountable to anyone. And then at the end of the day, you will produce medicine and you will want me to buy it. And of course, chances are I will not be able to afford this. And this is not the only example. I mean, we have in 1996 in Nigeria, in Kano State, we have Pfizer. Nowadays, thanks to COVID, drug companies, people now know drug companies, you know, everything from Johnson & Johnson to Pfizer to Moderna to all of these things. So it's also interesting to talk about that now. But so in 1996, they conducted the clinical trials during a meningitis outbreak in Nigeria. No informed consent was collected from the parents or guardians of children who had meningitis. Some of the children died from these because of these drugs that were being trialed. And Pfizer basically did not go to court, or they settled out of court, and we do not know today, you know, the details of what exactly happened, but they did settle out of court to avoid going into a public space in a court of law where they would have to divulge all of the information, and in the end paid very paltry compensation to the families of the people who were affected. In 2019, much more recently, again, Ebola outbreak, but this time in DRC, you see the global health system throwing in millions of dollars to control Ebola. You see, and we understand that this is because the people who give money, so many times the Western governments, they do not want these diseases to get to their part of the world. So the idea is throw in as much money as you can so that you contain the outbreak within a particular geographical area, and it doesn't matter as long as it is contained in that part of the world, we can afford it. And there started to be a lot of tension between healthcare workers and health facilities and communities in these areas, because people were asking. The question was, we always have malaria here. We don't have access to clean drinking water. We have diarrhea. Our kids die from these diseases every day. And no one comes to throw in millions of dollars. But now when there's this disease, Ebola, suddenly millions of dollars are thrown in. And so people start to doubt the science behind the disease. And because of that, actually, there were so many attacks. I think in the end, it was over 80 attacks on healthcare facilities, so clinics and hospitals, and many attacks on healthcare workers as well. Some were killed by communities because they wanted to push these people out. You know, they say, well, it means you bring the Ebola to us so that you can make money, because clearly if you were concerned about our own health, you would be providing us medicine for money, giving us access to safe drinking water so that we don't have to suffer from diarrhea. and therefore we would not suffer from all of these diseases. But now you come with all of this money to treat Ebola, and yet it's affecting such a small number of people. And then you have to start to understand the suspicion that people have of these interventions that people bring. In the end, health facilities have to be protected by the military, the same military that during the day goes to communities, killing people, pillaging communities and resources and so on. So you see the politics of how that plays out. And in the interest of time, just to go to the last example, what is to be done? I think I want to talk about two separate things, interrelated, but there's two issues for me. So firstly, we have the systematic issues and we have the individual issues. And the systematic issues that Shanaz speaks about very well in terms of the organizing principles of capitalism, of the patriarchal societies that we live in, and of racism. And I think we understand that. And for that, the only way, I think, as Shanaz rightly said, we have to understand what is at play, how these things interrelate, and how they affect the knowledge that we have and the practice of medicine and how we treat the patients in front of us. And secondly, then we have at the individual level, because you have the systematic, which is quite overwhelming and quite big. But at the individual level, I think also as we start to understand this, it means with each patient that we see in our practice, we are able to ensure that they have a slightly different experience because we understand all of these things that are at play. So we can start to affect or positively impact the lives of, or at least the experience of every single patient that we see. And again, it's only one person in a very big community, but we have to start somewhere. And I think this could probably be an option of where we start. I think I'll stop there. Amara, I know I've gone way too much, but and ask for questions from everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Whoa, that is a lot. And it really makes you question, because you see all these things in like the media and these headlines, and they don't always put the full picture as to what's going on behind the scenes. And when you see like CNN posting about Africa's health, it's always, you can see who's at the forefront and who is being posted. And it's those things that we have to question as well. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask, feel free to put up your hand and go for it. This is a place where we can discuss. It's a safe space, and it's in these discussions where we can spark new ideas and create a change. Simran, you can go.
Hi, everyone. Very insightful, and I genuinely have like questions, but I think most of them have been answered. Just one. So I had this recent encounter with one of my lecturers, and she was going on about pathology and, like the symptoms, and it wasn't really incorporated with the people of color. And so I sent her an email, I had this discussion with her, and she went on explaining about the signs and symptoms. But then when I mentioned of, including these type of topics into our lectures, she really said that like decolonization is the same as being more diversified. And so I just want to know, does it have the same concept? Does decolonization mean, including more people of color in your research and your textbooks? Or does it go way more than that? And how would I, as a student, counter that with like my lecturers, for example?
I would throw that question back to you, Simran, to give us a go at what you think.
So I was actually really hesitant to have this conversation with my lecturer. She was very, I wouldn't say progressive, but very affirmative in westernized quote unquote medicine. And she was very, I didn't know what to tell her or say. And so I have no words to like further extend this conversation with her. And I just need some insight on like how do I go on about this? How do I, as a student, like tell her to include this in our lectures?
Does anyone else have some suggestions for Simran?
And I also think like being more diversified is not the same as decolonizing. I think it could be incorporated, but it's not part of decolonization. But I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Simran. I think that the use of diversity is often used in corporates as well, in terms of like a kind of token type of thing where it's not actual change being made in terms of like what people have access to healthcare and those kinds of things. It's rather just putting people of color in these systems that are already in place without changing the system. So I feel like if your lecturer is talking about diversity as being the only means for decolonization, then I think that is a problem, because we have to be looking at how our systems in health are affecting marginalized communities because of colonialism.
If I can just add very quickly as well, I think one of the things for me is that, again, I go back to the opening part of my talk. Knowledge is subjective. One can only share what they know, and in practice, actually, if you see, it is very easy to see that in practice you have people who come from colonized society perpetuating the same colonial practices, because the system produces the result. It doesn't matter. Today we can put myself, tomorrow it's you, Simran, the following day it's Shenaz. Unless and until that particular system changes, it will produce the same result. So it cannot be that, diversity of people, of because again, this whole link with Black Lives Matter, it's not enough to include people. Yes, inclusion and diversity should be done. There's absolutely no question about it, but it is not enough and will not produce a different result if the system itself remains what it is today.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to what was shared by Carsten, the first starting point is to recognize we all colonized and we all produce these kinds of power asymmetries. And we all try to find ways within our boundaries of limits of ideas of how to best be inclusive. And diversity is a word, and it is an important word, but it isn't necessarily deepening social justice in a radical way that I think that we are proposing. And diversity was actually the strategy used by the UK government to almost sugarcoat the issue, to say, oh, we are so diverse, look at us, we welcome all different types of people. But when you look at the systems and structures, they're still violent and oppressive. And I suppose with your lecturers or with people who come from maybe different generations, different understandings, it's less so about what they need to do and more so about what you need to do for yourself to move your ideas and move towards creating a kind of like future you want. I think that's maybe the approach I take in my life, because I am not sure that it's I'm not sure that I want to spend a lot of time pushing back to the system. And the other thing about pushing back to the system is a context or a situation like the Fees Must Fall, or actually the Roads Must Fall movement, where it was a radical, organized protest that really forced people to awaken their minds to new ideas, is a really powerful technique. So I think you've got to be strategic. When do you resist? When do you take charge of your own learning? How do you become agents of your own transformation? And how do you become conscious yourself? Yeah, it's not an easy thing. And I think change is difficult for everyone. So for me, it's difficult in a world that's so unequal and complex to expect others to change for us. I just want to be sensitive to this idea that we expect the other to change when actually there's so much of work we've got to do ourselves. And I understand it's a lecturer, it's someone that's imparting knowledge. But how successful will you be? I don't know. This is a conversation. It's not a solution, really. But these are just some of the complexities that I've encountered. And yeah, happy to engage. I don't know when the session ends, though, because I need to leave in about 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Ms. Munshi and Ms. Noku. I think that definitely does help, and I think it's more of like changing my ways of studying as well, and not fully relying on the lectures. Yeah, Furezo, you have something to say?
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I also just wanted to say thank you to our speakers for the very insightful talk. And I was just wondering, how do we this is a question open to everyone, but how do we hold big companies and accountable when there's so much secrecy? This is in relation to what was said about like the Pfizer trials, where where they settled out of court. And would nationalizing pharmaceutical companies be a way, like a sustainable, you know, solution?
Carsten, do you want to take this? Sorry.
I can try. I mean, I don't know. Again, I think that the issues are quite systematic. So it's not only one element. So nationalizing the companies is just but one possible solution. But what we also have to confront to confront at this moment is the fact that many of these pharmaceutical companies actually use public funding, and now, of course, because of COVID, these things start to be much more public knowledge. I'm sure some of you have seen the news from I think one of the pharmaceutical companies, I think it's Johnson and Johnson in South Africa, regarding exportation of vaccines. There is way too much secrecy, and the way that our politics is run, and how the people who run drug companies, they know exactly what they want to hide. And if you go to the US, for example, where it's much more obvious with them paying lobby fees to presidential candidates. And so unless and until we regard health as a public good, and not a for-profit commodity, it is not possible that we are able to address all of these things. So I think we have to go back to regard healthcare and access to healthcare as not only a human right, but as a public commodity that should not be subjected to profit interests and profit motives by a few drug companies.
Muzammil, I saw your hand was up.
Thanks, Amara.
Also, I think, sorry, Mr. Muzammil, just a second. So I know that Ms. Munshi is out of time. So Ms. Munshi, you are welcome to leave whenever you have to go. I just want to say thank you so much again for contributing, and just one request from our side: if you don't mind sharing your presentation with us, we'd be grateful and honored. But yeah, thank you so much, and you are welcome to leave. And Mr. Noku, are you pressed for time, or can we take a few more questions?
I think I can still have a few more minutes. That's okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to say thank you so much for inviting me once again. And I'm like really excited about this. And my mind is a bit buzzing at the moment with many ideas. And I was just wondering if you could invite that lecturer into a session like this, because, it's about sharing information and knowledge. And this is really, there's so many ways in which you can get around it. But I also wanted to, before I go, recognize that even the language of like diversity can fall into the trap of another philosophical space of liberalism, and maybe Carsten may share some light on that. Um, Liberalism can be quite dangerous because it sort of feeds in like we're all equal, we should all, have distribute things equally, but it actually doesn't pay attention to the reality. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of knowledge that we need to unpack, and this is partly why I was suggesting in my lecture that we've got a lot more to learn before we can begin to know where we want to go. And if we don't begin that journey of learning, we may act in ways that reproduce different types or create new power asymmetries that are equally damaging or uh, violent or destructive or dehumanizing. And that's a warning from me to all of you. Thank you so much and have a lovely rest of your time. And I wish you all the best. Take care then. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. I think that's another thing that has been grating me, because I don't know exactly how, if we are if we individually trying to decolonize our minds, how do we spread that message across to people to create like a global movement where we are in the same on the same page type of thing. So I think that's also another question I have in terms of decolonization of medicine.
Sorry, could you please repeat the last part? I think I missed the last part.
Oh, so I was saying that when we are trying to question ourselves and our mind and how we have decolonized our minds, how do we get that message across to more people so that they can start questioning themselves and how colonization has impacted them, so that we can eventually lead to constructive change in the system besides individual work? How do we get collective work in the decolonization of medicine?
Yeah, if maybe I can refer to some two great decolonization scholars and medical practitioners. I will start with Steve and go to France. Living in other similar times, but we are talking about the 60s years, 1960s. I was not born yet. And yet the things that they started speaking about back then are still basically news to many of us even today. And I think that we have to be humble enough to recognize that it is not possible to think of this as a sprint. It is going to be a marathon, and we basically have to start building towards a movement that will eventually someday bear some fruits. And I don't think that it's possible to in a single day have people have the reflex of mind to realize and question themselves. So I think what we are looking at is, over a long term, these kinds of discussions, because yes, for many other students, decolonizing medicine still seems like something that is not worth their time. So it is about having those discussions within those small spaces, whether it's one person in a day or one person in a week. But that's the only way to build a critical mass of people who are interested in the subject to start to think about policy change and all of that. For the moment, we still collectively have to understand, even as people who are already engaging in the subject and talking about the subject, we still need to understand the problem much more, because there's still so many questions. I mean, someone was asking about what do we do with these pharmaceutical companies. I don't have a response that is precise, but I think that there is a set number of action points that we can do, and one day hope that these things will be much more open. As someone working in the space that I'm working in, actually, I think that in the past year, because of the pandemic, people have actually gotten interested to know how the pharmaceutical companies work. 2 years ago, it would not have been interesting to start to explain to people, the drug trials that the pharmaceutical companies were doing in Nigeria or in other parts of the world. We forget that actually in the 90s, we were in exactly the same spot where we are today with ARVs, with the same drug companies refusing generic companies to manufacture drugs. And there was a lot of noise made about it at that time. In the end, generic medication or ARVs became available, and then the whole thing died off. And now it's coming again. So it's also about the external environment that we cannot control, and we hope that with this kind of momentum, we can at least sustain some of the discussions going forward. I'll stop here.
Thanks. Thank you so much. It makes a lot of sense. I think Muzamil wanted to go and then Simran afterwards.
Thanks, Amara, and thanks, Karsten, for the amazing session. I really learned so much. Shanaz mentioned before she left, Fees Must Fall, and I must say that movement was playing in my mind throughout this session. I think during Fees Must Fall, we learned that decolonization of education and free education go hand in hand. And I think similarly, when we talk about decolonizing our healthcare system, we also need to be thinking about free healthcare and universal healthcare. So I just wanted to ask Karsten, towards this project of free decolonized healthcare, do you think that healthcare workers need to have a bit more power in the system, and particularly power in terms of expenditure and how we spend our money on medical resources? Because at the moment, these seem to be controlled by politicians, and healthcare workers have very little power in deciding where money is spent. So do you think that giving healthcare workers that power is a crucial step towards free decolonized healthcare in South Africa?
Thanks. I don't often feel very qualified to speak particularly about South Africa because I don't know enough, but I'll just try and speak in general terms. So I think for me, the point of departure is that healthcare workers themselves need to go through an understanding and these kind of discussions to understand that the care that they provide to patients on a day-to-day basis is actually, so much affected by the colonial relationship that medical doctors have with patients. And so then after that, then we can then take the next step and say, okay, with that in mind, then, because medical staff or healthcare workers now understand, their own relationship, and they can be able to question themselves, then we can move to the next step. Because the risk for me is that if you don't do that, the same healthcare workers will produce exactly the same results that we see from politicians. Because as I was saying earlier on, the system produces the same results. You cannot expect that, attending the university that you do, that you will come out differently from what the colonial system would have wanted you to become. So we have to take first step backwards and examine our own selves. And then after that, we can go into the next step. And this will, of course, then avoid, the kinds of, and now maybe I will allow me to speak about South Africa a little bit. A few months ago, when this whole thing about digital vibes came out, and people felt so betrayed because they were like, well, how could the Minister of Health, who's a doctor, oversee such kind of things in a pandemic? But again, I say, because the entire system is meant to function that way, so the only way to sort of immunize ourselves is going through these kind of reflections and making sure that when we practice medicine, we understand our place in the society and how we relate to patients. And then afterwards, we can start to see a different set of results, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. It really does. I think I have received a better understanding. It seems like the power that healthcare workers could get is sort of the last step in the decolonial project, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of actually dismantling and rebuilding a system before we can actually realize that goal. So thank you so much, Carsten. I appreciate that.
Thanks. And sorry, if I can also just add on the thought that came to my mind as well, is because what we don't want is that, once we have this process where healthcare workers, and again, I mean, I start from the premise that healthcare workers should be much more involved, and they should be involved because they understand the patients better and all of these things. But what we don't want is that, the day that healthcare workers become involved, and then the system doesn't function properly, people are still not receiving access to quality healthcare, and that is free from all of these colonial influences. And then, of course, we, the politicians, will come back and say, well, you see, they're not very different from us. Actually, these healthcare workers don't know what they're talking about. And therefore, we need to take this power away. So the only way we can ensure we have a sustainable thing and a sustainable process is to make sure that once we make a change to the system, we don't have to go back to what it was, because this change that we have introduced is actually quite fickle and is collapsing and starts to receive a lot of critique. And more importantly, of course, the patients are not receiving the healthcare that they demand or that they deserve as patients.
I also just wanted to add that I think over the years, healthcare has become more of a capitalist regime, and there's more profit involved rather than distributing these funds to the exact facility. So I think also giving the healthcare practitioners the funds and the control, it would definitely help in my perspective. But as Mr. Noku said, there are again challenges, and if we don't counter the, I think the consciousness and understanding that the root problem, I think, yeah, it's the same thing. Do we have any other questions, or does anyone have anything else to add?
I just had one more question quickly. I just wanted to know, so Shanaz mentioned it earlier, in terms of like as a doctor treating a patient, for example, she was mentioning something about like how you give your prescriptions or your doctor's notes and that kind of thing. So what would that mean as a doctor treating a patient? How would you give that prescription, for example, in a decolonized perspective? I just didn't understand in that sense. I don't know if anyone has any ideas.
I will probably want to hear from you guys, because I'm not a medical doctor at all, far from it. So yeah, I am. I mean, I have listened to people's takes on it, and at least the scholarship that is available is everything from that research has shown that in countries like the United States, for example, where you have quite a big group, or at least percentage of black people and white people, that it was clear from prescriptions that are given that black women in particular were not given, or rather doctors were very reluctant to prescribe pain medication, because there is this notion that, black women are tough and they can handle the pain. So we shouldn't bother giving them pain medication. But then when you have another patient walking in who happens to be white, then they get the prescription, at least get the drugs that they need to be able to, deal with the pain. And that's just one example, but I am interested to hear what the rest of the group thinks.
Hey, Amara. Would you mind please repeating your question?
I just wanted to know how prescribing medication and giving prescriptions to like any patient as a doctor, for example, how would you go about that from a decolonial perspective, and what are the issues involved in how doctors prescribe medicine?
Oh, thank you. I would like to just add on to what Simran said earlier about how even just like from a teaching perspective, a lot of the like health conditions are not like shown or recognized in people of color versus white people, and I think that already impacts the kind of the level of healthcare that you'll give if you're not taught in med school how to recognize issues in different like groups of people. And it also reminds me of, we learned in like second year about different like studies of like the correct medication to give in treating hypertension, and these studies were done on mostly Caucasian people in the like in the States and in the North, and those kinds of studies were used as like a source of information to implement treatment in hypertension in Africans. And it came out that these same treatments aren't as effective. So I think this is a very important discussion that needs to be held, but I'm not sure how to go about rectifying the inequalities, the deep inequalities that put the system in place. But yeah, I think it's a really, really relevant question, so thank you for asking that.
Thank you, Varaizo and Carsten, for your input. I really appreciate it. I think it's important to like be aware of how we are doing every action when we are trying to decolonize medicine, and that's where the individual part comes, where we have to look at ourselves in like every action we take as a healthcare worker, for example, and question it in those senses. And I think you are right. For Carsten, like how you were saying about the treatment of Black patients as opposed to white patients, and this idea that like Black people are stronger or whatever, can handle the pain. And I think those are the kinds of systems we have to acknowledge, and that those biases that we have to question. So thank you so much for both of your input. I learned a lot, and I think I'm going to read up a lot more as well.
Do we have any more questions? I think we are out of time, so just give like 1 minute more for anyone. But okay, so I think we've learned a lot, and I think we have a lot to unpack and read up on, as Amara said. And this has given us like an idea, or like an initiative really, to have more of these conversations on campus, and talk about decolonizing like our syllabus and the lectures, and identifying the root causes. I think one thing, and also just understanding the system. And yeah, so it's a lot of like self-learn in the process. But thank you, Mr. Noku, for taking out the time and again engaging with us. We appreciate it, and it was really short notice. So thank you so much for attending and giving all the information and insight that you have. And again, just thank you to the students as well for engaging with us. We are a small group of students, and I think it starts here. And I think we need to spread and create awareness about this. And we could be, you know, the catalyst effect on campus, which is definitely the plan. But yeah, thank you to everyone who's attended, and we cannot wait for our next session. So stay tuned on our social platforms and the Science Faculty Council's platform for the next session. Until then, stay warm, stay safe, and have a great week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for engaging.